everyone. I'm Corey Philly, and I am the Executive Director of the Vancouver Fringe Festival. And this is the second episode of All Things Fringey. Again, you can call and tell me whether you like that or not, but that's not the point. The point is we're going to have fun today because we're going to talk to some really cool human. So before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that we're in the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and it is an honor to live, work, and now do a podcast on these territories. So we are celebrating all things Fringe. Our Fringe Festival, the Vancouver Fringe Festival, is back September 8th to 18th on Granville Island, almost exclusively. And we have now our new... we have our new website up. It happened yesterday. VancouverFringe.com. Go there. All the shows are up there, and we are going to have tickets on sale as of Tuesday. Yes, Tuesday, July 26th. So that is really exciting for us. Our wonderful marketing and communications manager, Matt Ostrahan, has completely revived our website, which was lagging and sagging and quite orange, and moved it into something else. And we're also going to be, it's a different format for the program guide, and it's a different format for how you're going to pick out your shows, but not to worry. We're still the beloved Fringe that you know. We're just adding a few new elements and kind of mixing around with the other ones. In the last few years, of course, because of the pandemic, we've all gone into some kind of digital framework. And so we've just chosen to carry on in that manner with more rollouts over the whole August into September time frame instead of doing a large program guide like we have done pre-pandemic from 2019 before. So that's the cool thing. So the podcast is now happening obviously in July. This is a July podcast. We'll do one again in August. And then through the Fringe, we'll have a podcast every day. And what I'm hoping to do is just turn that over to the wild artists of the Fringe. So I'll introduce one person and they'll get to introduce whoever they want to in the next podcast on the next day and talk about what's happening on site and talk about their own shows and talk about art in general and fringes in general, because a lot of these people, they go across on the circuit, which happens through the CAF circuit, the Canadian Association of Fringe Festivals. And we're back again this year. So it's the first time that everybody's been on in-person Fringe for, since 2019. So it's very, very cool that people are back doing that circuit. So that's me. But I'd like to talk about now one of the beloved Fringe artists that has been, I don't know how long he's been doing Fringe. I'm going to ask him that question, but TJ Daw is with us today. Hey, TJ.
Hey, Corey. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Oh, I'm so happy that you're here. It is exciting to see you, and I see that you're coming from the inside of what looks like a basement. Maybe you could tell everybody where you are.
I'm at the Winnipeg Fringe, and I'm being billeted with Sherry and Stuart Pierce, and I'm not staying in the basement, but I am working in the basement. It's a good place to podcast.
And the show that you're talking about is?
Blueberries Are Assholes. It's my new show that I've been touring on the circuit this summer and that I will do after this in Edmonton, Victoria, and then end my tour in Vancouver.
Yeah, we're very excited about you coming. And TJ is going to be having a live streaming performance in also our new live streaming studio here at Leap Studios during the Fringe. So he'll be one of the artists that's actually doing a live streaming performance with audience, of course, but he is also in an in-person venue, but he'll be making his way over here for one of the days that he's not in the in-person venue to do the live streaming. So that's very cool. Now, TJ, I know you're a Vancouver boy. How did you get involved in the Fringe? I don't really know this, but I know you've been doing it for a very long time.
My first exposure to the Fringe was at a distance. By a strange coincidence, my high school was on the same block as the Vancouver Fringe headquarters in the 80s in Mount Pleasant. Oh. And because the Vancouver Fringe happens after Labor Day, that was right when the school year starts. Still is. Yeah. So I would be beginning my new school year, and all these weird people would descend into the neighborhood and put up these 11 by 17 posters. And I wasn't even clear that it was a theater festival. You know, the word Fringe doesn't inherently say theater, if you don't know what it is. Yeah. I would just see bus shelter ads for the Vancouver Fringe, calling for volunteers. And I'd see people putting up these posters, and the posters would say that the show had done well in cities like Edmonton or Winnipeg, and I was very snobby as a Vancouverite. That meant nothing to me. That did not entice me to go see those, even though I wanted to be an actor, even though I wanted to dedicate my life to it. So I was right at the hub of where the Vancouver Fringe started, and I never saw a single show. I had disdain for what I perceived the Fringe was. Then I went to UVic. I studied theater at UVic. One of my classmates put on a show in my first year. I went and saw it. And then a year later, a grad student was casting a touring Fringe show. And at the time, the word tour was unbelievably romantic to me. I was a very infrequently cast actor, and the play that he was casting was a 3-person play by Daniel McIver, whose work I had recently discovered and who was probably my favorite playwright at the time. His stuff was original, it was visceral, it was unusual and accessible and funny, but meant something. This particular play was called Never Swim Alone, and I auditioned and I got cast. So we toured in the summer of 1994. That's how far I go back. We toured through, we rehearsed in Victoria, and then we previewed in Kitchener, and then did the Toronto Fringe, Winnipeg, Saskatoon, Edmonton, and ended in Victoria.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And that was 1994. And that was my exposure to what the Fringe really is. And I got to be turned on to the fact that at the Fringe, as opposed to what I was being inculcated in theater school, where it's published plays, it's proven work, it's a classic, it's a Broadway hit, it's something from London's West End, or it's one of the great playwrights, that kind of thing. And audiences want a safe bet. Fringe audiences were up for anything. And most productions were minimalist because you have to load in and strike in a short amount of time. And if you want to tour, the less stuff you have, the more manageable that is. And people wanted to see something different. And they were open to seeing something that they'd never seen before. And if it was Canadian, that wasn't a disadvantage. And if it was unpublished, that also wasn't a disadvantage. If it was a one-person show or if it was a cast of all women, bring it on, as long as it's good. So a few years later, when I started having the impulse to write my own stuff and kind of follow in the footsteps of Daniel McIver and Spalding Gray and George Carlin and various other kind of left-of-center performance heroes of mine, the Fringe just seemed a no-brainer of like, well, that's the place to do it. So I did my first one-person show while a UVic student in the department. Then I did my second one at the Victoria Fringe in September. And then in the summer of 98, I booked myself a tour from Montreal all the way to the Vancouver Fringe. And I've been doing that pretty much ever since.
Well, that is such a cool story because, I mean, actually, I go back further than you in the Fringe, just so you know, though not with the same kind of a career involvement in that. I think in 1988, I did a production of Oedipus Rex, and I was a very what I would call chubby sort of chorus, one of the 3 Greek chorus women. I'm not sure that I was so chubby, but they put me in this kind of cheesecloth dress that kind of ballooned like this. So we were riding around in very hot weather with crimped hair, pretending that we were the Greek chorus in these lovely cheesecloth outfits that began to smell very bad at some point.
And what was your venue? Do you remember?
We were at Heritage Hall.
Heritage Hall.
On
Okay,
the top,
so that
on
was
the top.
Blocks from my school, and it's legitimately possible that you and I passed each other on the sidewalk, and I would have been like the short, awkward Catholic schoolboy in gray slacks and a green sweater.
Did you go to St. Pat's?
I did.
Oh
St.
my
Patrick's
gosh.
High School.
Yeah, my parents were East Side kids. They went to the St. Pat's as well, so I'm always aware
wow.
when I go over on that side that's when I see them. That's really interesting too. I think what you just said about sort of the freedom of doing something, but I also am interested in like what was. I guess 2 things. What was the impulse to start to write, or if you'd always been a writer? And the other thing is, how did you fund yourself through that first Fringe? Or did you get grants? How did that happen?
So I had always been a writer, but I'd never once thought of myself like that. So I would write comedic sketch ideas, or I would write letters, or I would write journal entries just to purge myself of whatever I was thinking. But my ambition was to be an actor, or otherwise to be a cartoonist. One of the big things I wanted to do when I was growing up, because I loved Mad Magazine, I loved Marvel Comics, I loved newspaper comics. I wanted to do that as well as be an actor. I loved Star Wars. I loved Raiders of the Lost Ark. I wanted to do that. Whereas writing plays or movies seemed like this mystical priestcraft. How does one do that? I couldn't fathom it. So I went to theater school to learn to be an actor. But like I said, while I was there, I fell in love with the work of people like Daniel McIver, who wrote and performed his own stuff, as well as Spalding Gray. I saw a double bill of Spalding Gray monologues, filmed monologues of his, but just of him sitting at a desk in a theater that's about Fringe size, about 100 seats, at the Ridge. The Ridge used to be this wonderful rep theater in Vancouver. And I was right on the verge of turning 18, right before I started theater school. And I went and saw this double bill of Spalding Gray stuff. And my jaw was on the floor of like, you can just do that? As opposed to what my experience was like in theater school, where there's the vast majority of actors who don't get cast, and then there's the few who do. I was in the vast majority who don't get cast. But the thing was, it was sad and disappointing, and I was bitter about that and jealous of the ones who did get cast. But at the same time, I didn't love Shakespeare. I didn't love Carol Churchill. I didn't love Chekhov. Like, I didn't stay up late grooving on their work the way I did listening to my George Carlin records.
Right.
So it was a while before I could admit that to myself, and before I finally connected the fact that this scribbling that I do in my spare time, that is writing. And maybe I could shape some of that into something that would work on stage. And then, like I said, once I had the experience of touring the Fringe and realized that there was a place where you could do that. And this is before there were story slams. There were probably poetry slams just starting, but I wasn't connected to that. And I didn't know anybody who did them. So I wasn't aware of that as an option. But this just seemed, and this is before the internet. So before there were blogs or anything like that, where there wasn't the same DIY culture that I was aware of anywhere outside of the Fringe. So that just seemed like, okay, then I guess that's how I'm going to do it. And I don't have to audition, and I don't have to submit a script. Most of the festivals were first come, first serve at the time. A few were lottery. Now they're almost all lottery. How I funded it was entirely by working shitty jobs.
Oh, wow.
It didn't occur to me to apply for grants. I wouldn't have known where to find them. I probably would have been too intimidated to look for them. But I had a pretty minimalist operation, and I have a pretty low expense lifestyle, and I had my eyes on the prize in terms of, like, I want to do this Fringe tour. This is how much it's going to cost per festival application. So let's sock away that amount of money out of each paycheck that I'm getting from my job. And then let's find a way to stretch that so that I can survive on the road. And I did.
Wow. Barely.
Like, I was starving for most of that Fringe tour because I had no reputation. I didn't really know what I was doing. My show was good, but it had an abstract title. It had an abstract concept. The media didn't know who I was. The staff and volunteers and regular audience members didn't know who I was. So in most cities, my audience would build towards the end. Right. So I was in the red for almost the entire tour until the very end, when things actually did quite well in both Victoria and Vancouver. And then all of that was part of what encouraged me to come back with a new show the next year. And the next year I built on the seeds that I had sown the year before, and the year after that, and the year after that, and the year after that.
Oh, wow. That is really, I mean, I don't know if you think about it this way, but it's kind of like a brave thing to do. I mean, not just because it's like, oh, I'm kind of sailing into the unknown and all that stuff, but also it's because it's sort of you're embracing uncertainty and risk and all those things, which actually is the Fringe.
Yeah. And at the same time, yes, like, it was brave. At the same time, I didn't think of it like that at the time because it seemed like the only thing to do. Because the dream that I had of expressing myself to the world was so strong, and this avenue seemed the only one that was available to me, as opposed to, like, other than go to Vancouver and audition for the Arts Club and Bard on the Beach and maybe get cast and maybe not. And even if I am cast, I'm in somebody else's show and probably not in the lead role, or film and TV, same thing. Like, whether I do that in Vancouver or Toronto or New York or LA, it's like I could throw myself against those impossible odds, or I could do this thing that just seemed a lot more manageable to me. So it's like, well, then I guess this is what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And let's find a way to do that. And something that it actually took me years, if not decades, to even understand about myself is that I have a pretty big psychological block about asking for help. So, like, it doesn't even occur to me. It's not like I have some inner argument where some inner critic voice says, you'd better not do that. It's like, I could have borrowed money from the bank or from my parents, or looked for funding or looked for sponsorship. Never crossed my mind. Not once. I just had internalized the message that I'm on my own, including how I'm going to pay for this. So, all right, let's do it.
Wow. Well, I really admired that. And also, I wonder, I mean, this is just a sidebar to what you're talking about with the Fringe, but, what I was really aware of during the late 80s and early 90s, that there was all these sort of offshoot festivals that started to happen in Vancouver. One of them, obviously, the Fringe started in 86 and then 85, I should say. And then like Women in View started. I don't know if you remember that festival and all that stuff. But it really, I mean, I don't know if this is true, but it always felt true. How about this? As being a Vancouver artist, is that there was, because there was sort of a lack of funding and lack of this different kinds of infrastructure that might be in Toronto, for instance, or Montreal, or elsewhere in North America, it felt like that Vancouver artists really embraced this, okay, well, if I need to find some place to do this, and I need to be this thing. The Fringe certainly is one of those places, but I've seen other places like, other companies like Theater Replacement and Boca del Lupo and places like that, companies like that took it to heart as a point of pride that they could find a place to actually do work that was not, as you say, mainstream work, or work that maybe even, as you said, people don't have a connection to.
Right. Most of the theater companies I can think of, if not all of them in Vancouver,
Yeah.
do original work. They do devised work. And maybe it comes from that ethos because, yes, you're right. Toronto and Montreal have always had that sense of like, we are culturally important cities. So government funding goes there. So there's just more sponsorship there. There's more media companies there. There's more of a sense of importance. Alberta has always had a lot of corporate sponsorship, just because there's a lot of money from the oil and gas companies. So a lot of that gets put into the arts. So there's a lot of established companies with like dependable funding there. Winnipeg, it's interesting being in Winnipeg. Winnipeggers love mentioning that, the fact that the theater here is actually thriving. Manitoba Theatre Centre is huge. Prairie Theatre Exchange. There's the ballet is big here. The symphony is big here. Whereas in Vancouver, growing up, that was always the sense that I had of like, we are on the fringe. We are on the West Coast. We're out in the boondocks of this glorified logging town, that nothing really important happens here. You're kind of on your own. So let's find a way to make that work.
Yeah.
Let's tell our own stories because you have nothing to lose.
Yeah, and I think also that was the time, now where I'm really dating myself, but it was the time sort of like post 1986 when the Expo happened, when it sort of, when I grew up in Vancouver, it was a small city. It was sort of like, as I was saying to somebody, you could go out to Spanish Bank and you could be on the beach and look back towards the city, and the skyline had been the same for years and years and years. Maybe once in a while there'd be a new high rise, but it was mostly you could see, I can see the Sun building, I can see all those kinds of things. And then right after 86, when it really pushed Vancouver forward in terms of people's perception, maybe not in terms of where people put money into the arts or anything like that, but just it's kind of exploded artistically with all these independent companies across genres, and really, I think, propelled the Fringe forward too, to continue, because once you start I think the Vancouver Fringe is the second oldest fringe in North America. So it sort of was something spoke to the ethos of that in Vancouver, obviously, to continue to sort of foster that, right, through the last, good Lord, almost 40 years. Yeah.
And these things become a virtuous circle in that as theater graduates come out of training programs in Vancouver, they're at least aware of what the different companies do and how many of them do original work. And that's just more on their radar than if they had grown up or had gone to school, say in New York or London or Toronto, where there's more conventional and established theater. And that just seems like that's much more of a possible path that you can take.
Yeah.
Whereas in Vancouver, you're just that much more aware. And then the Fringe is definitely a part of that, of like, oh, this is something people do. And then if you're out checking it out, it might just be luck of the draw, whether the first 3 or 4 shows you see are really, really good and blow your mind and speak to you, or are really, really bad and turn you off of it. But enough people have the good experience that they think, yeah, this is something I would like to do at least part-time, if not full-time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And when you started out, as you said, you started to write, you said around 1998, yes? That was your first show? Oh, so... I don't know if this is a weird thing to ask people who are artists, but did you feel at some moment when you started, because you've been at it since that period of time, was there like a year or a feeling or a moment where you went, oh, I know this genre, I know how to do this, I know how to tour, I know how to sell my stuff, I know that the work I'm doing is attracting people, I know, you know what I mean? Maybe that's just a gradual thing and you wake up and you all of a sudden have like I felt at one point, I just have a career. How did that happen? I just was doing jobs. How about you?
What happened on the artistic front was that the very first show that I ever did, which was while I was a UVic theater student, was in the spring of 97. The next show that I did was in the Victoria Fringe of 97. The show that I toured across Canada was in the summer of 98. So that was actually my third show. Okay. And I finished the first draft of that on New Year's Eve of 97 going into 98. And I remember sitting on a typewriter, sitting at my desk, writing on a typewriter and coming up with the ending as like devising it as I was hitting the keys and having one of those moments of eureka. Oh my God, this is the perfect ending. I've got something here. in a way that my previous two shows hadn't had. Like those felt all right, but they felt like stepping stones, which is exactly what they were. And I'm very glad that I didn't tour them because they wouldn't have done well and that would have been very difficult and discouraging. Whereas that moment where just something clicked, it wasn't because I'd read something, it wasn't because somebody had given me a note, it just happened. And that ending came out, I knew I had something. I knew I had leveled up. And that was the show that as I toured across the country, even when I was playing to single digit audiences, which I often was, that ending particularly knocked people's socks off and had people come up to me after the show and say, you got to come back. And when you do, I'm coming back and I'm going to bring people. So that's exactly what happened. So the moment that it felt like I've figured this out, like I've really got something here. Well, again, there's two of them and they both happen on that same Fringe. There used to be a Kelowna Fringe, which was simultaneous with the Edmonton Fringe. It was the exact same dates and for a very specific reason, because Edmonton was always the hardest Fringe to get into. So if you didn't get into Edmonton, you can do Kelowna and you don't have to disrupt your tour. Same dates, and then you can continue on to Victoria and then Vancouver. So in 98, I did the Kelowna Fringe, and it was not well run at all for many, many reasons. I'm backstage at my venue. Backstage is a closet. I'm literally sitting in a closet. And my stage manager comes and knocks on the door and tells me there's 6 people who've come to see the show that night. And I'm broke. And I'm like near the end of the tour. And I've been through all kinds of insane ups and downs, including getting mononucleosis in the middle of the tour.
Oh, good Lord.
And recovering from it. And I've worked my way back. And here I am resuming my tour for 6 people. And she asks if I want to bail. And I say, no, let's do it. They're here. I'm here. Why not? So I go out and I do the show. And halfway through the show, I have this moment of clarity where I didn't even pause. Like as I was doing the show, I could just feel that the show's coming across better than it ever had, like by far. And I was having the time of my life and the audience was in it too. And I could tell that they could tell that I knew we were all having this moment together, even though there were only 6 of them. And there's something kind of cool about being one of 6 people or a small number of people in a mind-blowing show of like, how are we the only people here? This is amazing. We're in on this well-kept secret. That was this moment where I just knew whatever I had to do to get here, whether it was work, whether it was illness, whether it was financial hardship, it was worth it. Whatever I will have to do to get back here is worth it. I will do that. Then after that, I did the Victoria Fringe, and contrary to the pattern of most of the festival, and partially because I had personal connections there, the show actually did quite well. And then Colin Thomas from the Georgia Strait came and saw it in Victoria, so my review was out on day 1 of the Vancouver Fringe, and it was an extravagantly good review. And my venue that year, the Fringe had moved to Commercial Drive. My venue was the Legion, which is quite spacious. It seats 200 plus. I think 220 was the capacity. And I showed up for my first performance, and there was a lineup around the block, and I just immediately thought, oh, the show before mine has a really good house. But then I did the math and realized, no, wait, the show before mine is in right now. That's my line. But they didn't recognize me because they'd never heard of me. All these Vancouverites, they'd never seen me in anything. They never heard my name. They just read this extravagantly good review in the Georgia Strait that came out on Thursday, and now it's Friday at prime time, and there's a lineup around the block to see me. And so I just quietly go in the back, and then I come out on stage, and again, the show just kills. And the entire run in Vancouver just kills. And I feel like a rock star when I'm coming out, and I'm making more money per performance than I've made in most entire festivals that I've done on the tour up to that point. But again, the money is gravy. The most important part was just the satisfaction of feeling like it's working. Like the thing that I wanted to come across is coming across. And that magic moment that I'd had sitting on my typewriter when the ending came to me wasn't false. It wasn't self-aggrandizement. It wasn't just me blowing smoke on my own ass. It was real. And people were getting it. And the enthusiasm was real. And yet again, I must do more of this. And whatever it takes to get back here again, both physically and artistically, I'll do it. Wow. And I committed myself to do that. And that's what I've been doing ever since.
Wow. Do you have a number attached to how many shows that you've done? Like, because you do a new show every year usually, yeah? Yeah.
Blueberries or Assholes is number 18 of the shows I've written and performed myself. What I don't have a number off the top of my head for is a number of shows I've done with other people, where like usually I'm co-writing or dramaturging or directing or some combination of those things. That's a much higher number. And now I actually teach solo shows online. Did a course at Langara for a number of years. Now it's online. And there's a number of shows that are coming out of that. Yeah. So again, it's hard to describe my relationship with a specific show like that, because if I work with somebody in the course, I'm not necessarily their director or their dramaturg,
right.
But I did have strong input into the creation of that show.
Yeah. And that's a really interesting thing, as I was going to ask you about that, is that when did that start to happen? I mean, obviously it's a gradual thing where people kind of ask to assist, but now honestly, sometimes I'm just starting to talk. I was saying there's an artist, everyone that her name's Janet Law, and she's doing a show called You and Me at the site-specific show at the Fringe, and we went for a lovely walk the other day so she could see her where she was going to be and just chatted. And then in the course of all of this, I found out that you were a dramaturg with her, or a director for her?
And director, yeah.
Director for, and I was like, of course you are, because every time I talk to somebody, they just tell me that. But when did that start to happen? Because, it's interesting when you all of a sudden sort of come into your own as an artist, which you kind of described, and obviously there's more development and everything that has happened over the years and through their shows, and you've had a lot of things that have occurred, which have been very cool. Which we can talk about too, but I am interested, like, when did that portion of it become like the mentorship portion of it? You know what I mean? Where you said, hey, somebody said, can you be my third eye? Or could you be a person who would direct me? Or how did that evolve?
I kind of tripped into it, because one of my classmates at UVic Theater was literally one of the funniest and most talented people, I believe, on the planet, Charlie Ross.
Oh, yeah.
Who has a world-class, and I don't mean that hyperbolically, a world-class facility with pantomime, sound effects, and voices, and knows the Star Wars trilogy better than George Lucas does, as do I. So we loved hanging out together. He loved making people laugh in the back halls of the theater building, and he was never cast in a comedic role, which baffled me. It's like, you're going to cast somebody who's like Chaplin level funny as the king? But that happened to him again and again and again. So I always was goading him to, like, you've got to do a one-man Star Wars show. Like, nobody could do that better than you. And then we were working on an ensemble project, and I just, again, goaded him into coming up with something. So he did, and it just killed. So we were doing that ensemble show at Western Canada Theatre in Kamloops, and I convinced the AD to give us 2 late night slots on the weekend, and for Charlie to do that show like in full, to expand it. We're in Kamloops during the day. We don't have anything else to do. So they're very generous. They let us use the space for free. We just go in there, and he starts running it, and I start giving him feedback. And it's like a number of days into the process before we just have the conversations like, am I directing? Like, is that what that means? I mean, I didn't study directing. I don't have any directing theories. I had never thought of that as something I could or would do, but I'm giving feedback, and the show's getting better every time you do it. And okay, yeah, sure. All right. I'm the director. And then he ended up touring the Fringe with that. And it was one of the great success stories, not only of the Fringe, but of my career. And he's still doing that show. He's raising a family, paying a mortgage, doing one-man Star Wars and various other parody shows that we worked together. So that led to me working with other people, but almost always people that I had a close relationship to, like him.
Right.
Some of the bullshit that I had to understand about myself and get over, very related to what I mentioned before about not thinking that it was okay to ask for help, not occurring to me.
Yeah.
Was all of that comes down to the same thing, which is just a deep-rooted shame at the foundation of my personality, a belief that I'm not wanted. And it was through personal work that I ended up writing multiple shows about, partially through reading the books of Gabor Mate, partially through understanding my personality type via the Enneagram, partially through doing transformative ceremonies, some of which were facilitated by Gabor Mate or involved entheogens or psychedelics and different things like that. I really had, and continue to have for the last 10 years, an ongoing process of excavation of who I am and what the stories I've been telling myself my entire life is, and how many of them aren't actually true, how many of them don't actually stand up to scrutiny. And that opened me up to teaching a class. So when I was asked to teach a class at Langara, I was actually able to do it. And then that just became another virtuous circle. The more I did it, the more I got better at doing it, the more I loved doing it, the better experience the people took it had, the more they would tell other people about it, to the point that now, I don't even have to advertise. It's by referral. Like, people reach out to me and say, when are you doing that course again next? And I love doing it. I love getting into the zone with people. And I love being the voice that I really would have benefited from in those first 2 shows that weren't very good, because I didn't know what I was doing.
Right.
But there was nobody I could ask, or at least it didn't occur to me to even look for somebody that I could ask. But there were no courses, there were no workshops, there were no books on how to create a one-person show. It's just kind of, well, you're on your own, figure it out, kid. So I did. Not everybody has the gumption to do that, nor should they. That's not necessarily the best way to do it. Like, it took me 3 shows to figure out what I was doing. Mm-hmm. So if I can at all help somebody accelerate that process and pull their brilliance out of them, or just show them that they're smarter than they think they are. That's often what I do when I'm working with people, is I'm the outside eye. Quite often my interaction with somebody is to say, that's good. Keep going.
Right. Which
and
is
that's
often what people
all
are
they
looking
need.
for. Yeah. Well, sometimes it's like it's like water in a desert. Like, you're thinking, oh, I'm the oddball out here. Nobody's really going to enjoy this. Well, because we all beat ourselves up, whatever we do, about how, it's the question around perfectionism, right? Versus like, no, we're actually sharing humanity, which is imperfect. And so consequently, how we're going to show up in these experiences is actually what people are relating to, is our imperfections highlighted and connected to other humans, right? So often. I love how you speak about that. That's a really cool way of talking about, sort of personal work. I mean, you can't really separate art and life, of course, but personal work and how that it affected you. And I know, it was medicine. That was what it was called, right? Your show that I saw it at the Fire Hall when you did it, and Gabor Mate was there. And could you talk about like what that experience was, working like with that, because you were really working with mental health issues. You're really talking about a whole bunch of different things, and you were very, very, I thought, conscious and very responsible about how you were doing it, right? You were talking about it as a personal story, but then you had a human being there who was offering a more global perspective and more kind of insight, and because that was his channel of work. How did that, I mean, I guess, how did that come about to some degree, but also what are the values that you took as an artist, as a human, from that, I guess, and made it crucial that you did it in the way that you did it?
Well, the retreat that I attended, that Gabor ran, and Gabor Mate is a Vancouver-based physician, author, activist, whose central theme running through his entire work is that unprocessed stress and trauma from early life wreaks havoc in adulthood in any number of different ways. So each of us has our own favorite flavor of self-sabotage. And we're often not aware of what it is. And part of the way we sabotage ourselves is to spin what we do so it doesn't seem like it's self-sabotage. We'll tell ourselves certain stories about ourselves or about our family or about how we need to be or how the world is. So the way that retreat worked was Gabor, we were all sitting in a big circle. There were 24 participants or ish. And Gabor would dialogue with people one-on-one with a technique that he's come to call compassionate curiosity. And it's kind of a superpower. It's a brilliant thing to witness, of the way he can ask someone a few questions. And this is a harsh word to describe what he does, because he's not harsh in any way, but he disrupts your story. So if somebody says, I don't know why I have an eating disorder. I had a perfect childhood. He'd say, okay, tell me about your perfect childhood. And then the person would go on to describe their childhood. And then he would point out that their perfect childhood included one parent who was an alcoholic and another parent who had died by suicide. And so that's perfect. Or they would be describing something really traumatic, but they'd be smiling as they do it, as if it was their responsibility to take care of you, the listener, as if it's okay because it happened in the past and it doesn't really bother me. But of course, how could it not if somebody had something horrific happen to them? So he would help them come to this place of self-understanding of like, what are the ways that I've been deceiving myself? What are the ways that I've been deceiving myself, not because I'm bad or stupid, but because I'm sensitive and vulnerable and I need to cope with life. Something that I can have compassion about for doing. And then that would help you form an intention that you could then offer up when you then drank ayahuasca, which is a shamanic plant medicine with strong psychotropic properties from the indigenous people of the Amazon. And ayahuasca has a different effect on everyone and has a different effect on each person every time you do it. So powerful things come up. And then afterwards, you debrief. with Gabor and with the room, and and all of this camaraderie would come out of all this understanding, all of the compassion would come out. And on the final day, I had one of those aha moments where that foundation of shame just dissolved.
Wow.
And I felt an incredible connection of love, not only to the other people in the retreat, but to the people who lived nearby the retreat center who didn't even know who I was, who I couldn't see and who couldn't see me, to the entire human race, to everyone and everything. I just exploded with love. And it was unfathomable to me to not share this as a story. I just knew right away, this will be my next show. And Gabor jokingly asked me if I was going to do a show about this. And I told him I'm already working on it. So that retreat was in March of 2011. I wrote the first draft in January of 2012. By then, my ego had come back in to stop me from doing it, because that would involve divulging very personal, difficult, shameful things about myself and about the way my mind works that I'd never said to anybody before that retreat, and that I was terrified to say in public. And as much as that terror tried to stop me from doing it, another part said, do it anyway, gently and powerfully and full of love. So that's what I did. And then when I did the show, I didn't do it at the Vancouver Fringe. I did it at a bunch of other fringes, but I did it at the Fire Hall Arts Center as part of their season in the winter of 2013. And Gabor was able to join me for Q&As after the show. So it's propitious in a number of ways. I mean, the Fire Hall Arts Center is in the downtown East Side. Gabor had worked as a physician at the Portland Hotel Society in the downtown East Side, and had written his book about addiction, about his experiences working with hardcore addicts in the downtown East Side. And Gabor is a lot more famous than I am. So that run sold very well, particularly because of his involvement. And he was happy to be there and happy to be a part of it, because it engages him, it engages the community with these ideas. He thought that the show did a very good idea of illustrating what his work is like and what the experience of being on ayahuasca is like, which is really hard to capture because it's mystical and it's unique and it's multifaceted, and it's really hard to get across. And here I was doing it on stage just as one person talking, no set, minimal lighting cues, minimal sound cues, just a story, and a story with emotions. And this is the most important part, told in the present tense. So I'm not talking about this thing that happened 9 months ago or however many months ago or years ago, even though obviously it was in the past. I'm talking about it in the present tense as if it's happening now, and I'm experiencing the emotions as if they're happening now, including the sadness, including the shame spiral that I went into after the first ceremony, and then including the burst of love that I just described, like really feeling it and sharing that with groups of people and being witnessed and mirrored by them, which for a person whose central issue is shame and whose foundational stories is that I'm on my own, that I'm not seen and I'm not loved and I'm not wanted, to then be witnessed compassionately and lovingly by people again and again and again, it's like by grace or by guidance of some mystical force, I had found the perfect way to process all of this on stage and for those stories to just not have a chance. And it's not like I'm now an enlightened being and those stories don't have any place in my psyche anymore. Of course they do. They come back, particularly in times of stress. But the experience of doing that will never really leave me. It certainly hasn't, and has led me to other forms of personal work. And all of that was guiding me as I was creating the show and as I was touring the show and kind of tweaking it in terms of like finding the right balance between personal narrative and doing kind of like I've briefly done in this interview, just describing who Gabor is, what ayahuasca is, what the retreat consisted of, what the issues that I was there to explore, how those play out for more people than just me. One of the books that Gabor had referenced in one of his books was a book about the significance of skin contact in early life and childhood development. I read that book and it hit me in the heart, and I summarized a number of passages from it. And I connected with audience members afterwards. So that was part of the show too. And one of the advantages of doing a show in that scenario or at the Fringe is that the performer is very accessible.
Yeah.
There's no VIP tent at the Fringe.
No.
If an audience member wants to meet a performer, they won't have a hard time finding them. The performer will probably come up to them, in a lineup, handing them a flyer or trying to sell them merch or just, they'll just be out and around. And at the Fire Hall, I made a great point of hanging around after the Q&A if anybody wanted to say hello, and many people did. So I was able to connect with people one-on-one, and that fits with my overall love of what theater can do that Netflix can't. Or that TV can't, or that novels can't. You know, I love Netflix, and I love TV, and I love novels, but they're not directly interactive in this way. And that's something theater will always have better than those media. And I think that's why it's still alive.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's such an interesting thing that you're saying all that too, because I remember being, I actually saw it at the Fire Hall, and I was, and I remember being there, and it was packed, and everybody was so, what I remember is everybody was so quiet, and everybody was having this really shared internal dialogue with themselves. You could see it, like when people were doing it. They were looking at you, you were telling them the story, but that story was just being like absorbed into them, and they were thinking about their own, you know, their own experience, whatever their pain was, whatever their thing was. And I was thinking, because my whole thing was when I was watching, I was thinking, wow, I don't know if I could take something that I knew would like kind of move my brain in a different way. Like I couldn't get out of it. You know what I mean? Because I have a fear of claustrophobic, like that kind of claustrophobic feeling of like, I can't climb out of this experience. But it's also one of those things where you think, well, maybe that's part of the issue, right? Is that sort of issue around control and all those things. It was a very I felt very moved by that. And I felt, really moved. I really feel even now, I mean, it's been 10 years almost, and you're talking about it, how moving how you feel moved still by this experience and how it changed you.
And it's interesting that you describe the audience experience like that, because that's exactly what the retreat was like.
Yeah.
Because Gabor would dialogue with people one-on-one, but in a group setting. And as he was asking somebody a question, even if that person's life circumstances were completely unlike your own, you couldn't not ask yourself that same question. Yeah. And you start to absorb his way of looking at things, but with compassionate curiosity. So yeah, even though the story that I told on stage was specific to my life in every possible way, even though very few people have life circumstances that are at all similar to mine, on the surface, they're asking themselves those same questions. Where does my shame come from? What would I be afraid to admit in this? What was my childhood like? Did I get the skin contact that I needed? What are my coping mechanisms? How do I sabotage myself? How do I talk to myself internally after I've done something self-sabotaging? How cruel am I? Is there any part of me that's still suffering and deserves compassion? And yeah, the emotional connection is still there for me, even as I'm saying these words right now. Like that's part of why that show has had such a life-changing effect on me. I don't say that glibly, life-changing.
I will know, and you know it's so funny. I came in to the beautiful Brookville Productions human beings that are here today, and I ran in and I said, I'm really late, and you know, and everything. I had a bit of a morning, and you know, I've been in this is specific to the Fringe, but I've been in a position for a few months, which has been very different from what I used to do, to some degree, right, in terms of the scope, and I have been having those conversations with myself about, you know, what am I bringing in historically into a situation in which it's not personal, really, but I'm making it personal. And yet also, what am I bringing in that's valuable that because you know, I mean, I'm not one that subscribes to the whole idea that, you know, that this isn't a personal experience that I'm doing at a workplace. It is a personal experience, right? I'm not some automaton in that I'm working through a system. So like, what am I bringing in here that's of value? And really having those conversations constantly with myself and coming up against some interesting, weird things that you go, oh, right, I recognize this, I understand this. And so very interesting and very, I love how you're speaking about it, though, with your compassion for yourself and compassion for the experience, and also just that really life-changing experience. I'm interested, too, because you just said about television, because I know you've written for television. So how do you bring, I guess, that ethos into that experience? Because you're writing for other people sometimes, or are you writing for yourself, or?
Well, I haven't actually written for television.
No,
I've written satirical stuff for humor websites online. Okay. And I wrote the first draft of what became the feature film, The F Word.
Right.
Co-wrote that, but that's based on a play that toured the Fringe. Oh. So I had a writing partner, so we knew that script inside and out. And that was based on mutual experiences that we had. Writing for other people, but it is the same for it's the stage. It's a matter of trying to find that person's voice. Like, I guess the closest experience I would have is one that I'm working on now. Kind of, it's an ongoing thing. Scott Dickers co-founded The Onion. He's the founding editor of The Onion.
Oh.
And I'm taking an online comedy writing class of his. And he has set himself the crazy challenge of writing and performing 10 to 20 minutes of original stand-up comedy on YouTube every week.
Wow.
That's a colossal output.
That's
so
huge.
He has contributing writers, and I'm one of them. So I write and feed him jokes once a week, and then he picks and chooses the ones he likes and rewrites them as he pleases, and then fits them into the contributions from the other writers and his own ideas, and meshes them into something cohesive that he then puts online. And if anybody wants to watch it or listen to it, it's called Scott Dickers Around. Dickers is spelled with 2 Ks, and it's wonderful. So yeah, I have recently read all of his published books. And there's a lot of learning that happens by osmosis with something like that. And of course, I've watched all the videos that he's put online of like, what's his vocabulary? What's his point of view? What's he interested in? And I'm also learning from which jokes that I pitch him does he use, which ones does he not, in terms of like, okay, these seem to fit with him more than others. What are his main concerns? What are his attitudes? What are the kind of jokes that he likes to tell? So it's a matter of just like, as much as possible, crawling inside the skull of another human being and learning to think and talk like them. And then the other big tool that I use for that kind of thing is the Enneagram. So the Enneagram is something that I've done a couple of shows about. It's something I study. It's nominally a personality typology that posits there being 9 basic personalities. This is a huge passion of mine. And my partner and I study it. We lead workshops on it. I've presented at conferences about it. I co-host a podcast about it, the Enneagram in a Movie podcast. And it is a massively valuable tool for understanding perspectives that are different from your own, but are still perfectly legitimate. What makes people tick? Or what are the hidden layers behind the surface of somebody who looks one-dimensional? Or your interaction with them, whether they're somebody you know or somebody you've seen in a movie or something like that, of like, you might see them as being one thing, but nobody is just one thing. We all have multiple layers to us. So what are those multiple layers? So again, when I'm writing characters, when I'm writing something that isn't autobiographical, I think of that. Like one of the projects I did over the pandemic was I did an outdoor immersive walking adaptation of the board game Clue. And I directed this by Zoom. It happened in LA at an outdoor mall. So I was working almost exclusively with actors I'd never met before, on existing characters. And I would write a monologue for each of the actors to say, so that when the audience comes and questions them, they've got their statement of, here's why I did not murder Mr. Body, here's what I was doing.
Yeah.
They can't sound like me. You know, they need to sound like 6 distinct different people. So I gave each of them an Enneagram type. And then I thought of different famous actors that I can think of who I believe are that type. And imagine, okay, if Nick Offerman was playing Colonel Mustard, what's a line that would sound right coming out of his mouth?
Yeah.
You know, if Catherine Zeta-Jones was playing Miss Scarlet, what's a line that would sound right coming out of her mouth? And it might not sound right coming out of mine. But again, like I'm crawling inside the skull and the heart of somebody else, and with compassion and curiosity. So not like they're a villain, not like they're a hero, not like they're wrong or right or good or bad, just like they're a person trying to get their needs met, just like anybody else is. They might be doing it in a different way than I do, but they have their own way of doing it. And that opens up certain doors. Yeah. Because certain personalities have humor that's a certain way, or have speech rhythms that are a certain way. So that actually gives you a lot to work with as a writer. It's one of the most valuable tools in my toolbox.
Wow, that's really interesting. Now I wanna look at what you do on that and go, and also go, and go, that's me. That'd be I think that's the funnier part, when you like do one of those things and you think, oh, that is me over here. This is how I actually am in the world. That's very cool. I am wanting to know, I guess, now that this tour is the first time that have you been, well, you've done a few things. I know because you, in my previous job, you worked for me for a project, but is this kind of the first tour you've been back where you've been full on with audiences, and how has that felt?
Yeah, this is the first time really in front of like multiple audiences. Yeah. Since before the pandemic. It feels amazing.
Wow.
And this new show is much more comedy oriented than most of the shows I've been doing in the last 10 years. So there's a certain way that you know when comedy is working. People laugh, and you can hear it, and you can see it. And it's music to my ears. It feels incredible. It's like I've got fuel being pumped into my spirit with every laugh. It's absolutely wonderful. And then the other thing that's happening, and this is my favorite thing about touring theater, I've toured the Fringe, but this is hardly unique to the Fringe. But like, as I do this show, because I'm the writer of it, I can change anything. And I can come up with a line on the fly. I can come up with it in between performances. It might be a suggestion of a peer. It might be somebody I've reached out to and said, hey, this part's never really worked. What do you think? And then I can try different things, and the quality just rises and rises and rises as I figure shit out. And what could be better than that?
That is really, really cool. I mean, now I'm going to ask you, what is Blueberries Are Assholes? Give me your elevator pitch and anything else you want to say, but how about your elevator pitch?
It's comedic riffing. It's the closest to stand-up comedy I've ever done, even though I didn't workshop it in a stand-up club. But it's me pontificating comedically about all of the many, many absurdities that surround us every day that we normalize, ignore, or are utterly unaware of, focusing on three main areas: the human body, food, and the English language. And ultimately, it's a message in favor of perpetual curiosity. Because when you are perpetually curious, you notice how strange it is that we say bless you when somebody sneezes. And then you start asking, why do we say that anyway? And in fact, why do we even sneeze? Not just like the biological explanation, but like sneezing is actually pretty strange. To scream and blast out phlegm and germs, and that we think that's normal, that we just do that all the time. It's actually hilarious if you stop and think about it. And if that's your regular lens, everything is like that.
Yeah.
And it's actually delightful to go through life like that. So that's the ultimate message of the show is let's be curious, always, forever.
That's amazing. I love that whole that thing, because basically what you've given your task for this particular show is that you are looking at what is curious, obviously, and you create a show, and now you've just sustained that. It's actually, I don't know if you always like that, but in terms of when you are working on something that you're touring, but it's really a cool thing to hear that you remain curious out from what people's input is and how you can change that, and just being in a room and hearing people and seeing how they're reacting to what you're doing.
Well, that has a lot to do with the personal work that I've been doing in the last 10 years. Because what personal work does is it doesn't get rid of your ego, but it clarifies it. So you're not as held in a stranglehold by your stories. And when you're not as held in a stranglehold by your stories, you're actually freer to perceive what is. You don't have to find things and find a way for them to confirm your story about yourself. And again, this is something the Enneagram helped me understand, because that's a big part of learning your Enneagram type is, what are my type stories? And again, this just repeats what I've said before, but my type stories are variations on I'm not seen, I'm not wanted, I'm not loved. So if you can actually look at that with clarity, does that stand up to evidence? In my case, not really. And in fact, it never really did. But there was some part of me that needed to believe that, so I did. And now it's not like that's never ever there. It crops up all the time, but it's there. It's not as loud. And when it's not as loud, I'm freer to notice things like, hey, yeah, why do we say bless you anyway? Why is it rude to not say bless you? And then to not have to come up with a story about that that fits my narrative of like, everybody says bless you, but I'm not gonna because I'm smarter and different than everybody else. Or anything like that. It's just like, isn't that interesting? It's actually kind of funny.
Yeah.
And then, so the healthier psychologically and emotionally you are, the more curious you are, I believe. And then life is just that much more enjoyable, because wonder and delight surround us at all times. We just generally don't notice because we're so caught up in our shit.
Yeah.
There's no room.
Yeah. That is really a lovely thing to say. It's true too, isn't it? I really love how you express that, because I certainly when I get stressed, when I I'm having like either internal conflict or external conflict or whatever's going on, and I forget, like, I live in a really beautiful place, and I currently I drive back and forth to my work, and so and I have a lot of time. And if there's not a moment that I can't look up and go, wow, look at those mountains today, or look at what we're doing today, or this other thing today, I know that I need to do a restart with myself, because it's so because I've now got into this like layer of, it's just a grind and life is hard and all that stuff, when I actually feel most of the time I have a great position. I have really great friends. I have enormous health, and I have privilege all over the yin yang, and I really feel that way. But it's such a different thing, right? When you see where your pattern is, and that you go to that, because it's comforting in some weird way to be miserable in that particular way, right?
And I also believe that if you look closely enough, there isn't just beauty in the mountains, which are inherently beautiful, and very few people would dispute that. There's also beauty in a crack in the pavement. And if you look at closely enough, if you really give it a chance, if you open up your heart and your perception to it, it can break your heart with its astounding beauty. And it's something that you would have not even noticed. Or if you'd noticed, you might have noticed it with derision. Look at that crack in the pavement. This place is going all to hell. But if you stop and just look at those patterns, look at the way it wiggles back and forth, look at the power of water and rain that can work its way through something as seemingly solid as pavement. Look at how impermanent we are with all of our trappings of civilization. Think of how we fit into this longer picture of how our ancestors go back literally hundreds of thousands of years or millions of years to the origin of life itself, and how all of that can be contained in something completely mundane, even something ugly. But if you let yourself, the wonder of it can transport you. And even the most mundane and ordinary moments can fill you with bliss. And that's a way that I would like to live. And that's a way I think I would like everyone to live. I would love everyone to have that. And that's the way we can connect with each other and be with each other, particularly at a Fringe festival.
TJ Daw, you're a wonderful human being. Thank you very much for doing this. Blueberries Are Assholes is going to be at the Fringe Festival, VancouverFringe.com. It's all alphabetical. You cannot miss it. You're a delight to talk to, a lovely, lovely person. Thank you so much for doing this. I'm going to see you in a month, I know, but have a wonderful time between here and there, and finish well at the Winnipeg Fringe, okay?
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me on. It's been an absolute joy. I'll see you in a month.
Yeah, thanks, TJ. Bye.
Bye.